This Vox video has a lot of glaring issues, but I'm just going to focus on buybacks. It's something frequently misunderstood by everyone. I will just be explaining why exactly the information about buybacks in Vox's video is misleading. If you want to learn more, I suggest these 3 articles. They can teach you a lot about the market implications of buybacks in a way that I can't. Additionally, there are some more things wrong with the video, but I don't want to be pedantic about them, as the video is just about buybacks.
But the people in charge of those companies had an idea. They started buying shares of their own company stock from investors. This is a stock buyback, an attempt by the owners of America's biggest corporations to hang on to their wealth while the rest of the country suffered the worst depression ever.
So this is the most misleading thing in the video to me. It seems to imply that the stock buybacks were a response to the depression, and it was meant for these fat cats to stay rich while everyone else suffered. This is just plain wrong. In the words of the Wall Street Journal writer Jason Zweig, share buybacks are about as American as apple pie. In the 18th century, stock buybacks were mandated on top of dividends. Politicians and citizens alike didn't trust corporations not to squander excess profits. And in 1798, the Pennsylvania legislature granted a corporate charter to the Germantown and Reading Turnpike Road Company with one caveat. If the excess profits were left over after a 9% dividend, the company would be required to use the excess funds to buy back as many of its own shares as it could afford. This practice was largely universal. Mandatory stock buybacks normally range from being required after a 5 to 10% dividend, and usually existed to prevent corporations from pocketing excess funds or intentionally wasting money. But I'll go more into that later.
The Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. It cracked down on manipulation and insider trading. And corporations took this to mean that their buyback days were over. They pretty much stopped doing them.
That last point is wrong. Very wrong. Stock buybacks remained relatively common, and between 1954 and 1963, 53% of NYSE-listed companies reacquired some of their own stock. And mind you, this isn't a backdoor dealing. Companies are free to buy back their own stock on the public market. It was around this time in academia that it started to be perceived as negative when a company would buy back their own stock. Thus, in the 70s, buybacks only total about 1/10 of dividends by dollar volume. Once they picked up in the 1980s, I'll touch on that in a minute.
He wanted companies to put less of their profits into reinvestment in wages. He thought more should go to investors. So in 1982, he changed the rules. For the first time since the 1930s, companies could buy back shares of their own stock from investors, and they didn't have to worry about the government coming after them.
Again, that's not right. Companies very freely conducted buybacks during that time. But during the upswing of buybacks in the 1980s, smaller and newer firms tended to lean towards repurchasing shares as a way of payout to equity holders. But more established firms did also begin to buy back their own stock. But there's little evidence to suggest that money actually got redirected away from dividends in any way. Now that more of the video has been presented, I'd like to go back a little bit. The SEC largely didn't punish too many corporations for participating in buybacks before 1982. Usually, they just did this if, quote, it disrupted the natural order of the financial market. Buybacks were permitted in these circumstances: raising a stock's price during a merger to ease angst, reducing the number of shares outstanding after a merger, buying back stock from large equity holders, or assisting in management of debt securities. What happened in 1982 was not a regulatory cut. It merely acknowledged stock buybacks in the SEC rulebook. Before, companies were indeed afraid of using buybacks too frequently, as it could result in the SEC rapping on their door. The 1982 SEC rule change simply added a safe haven from the 1934 law. It classified less buyback options as a manipulation tactic. But this also came with additional regulation that did not exist before. Only a single broker per day can be used, trading done in the last half hour before market closes to be avoided, and there is a daily volume limit.